Everyone's heard of paratroopers. Most people have seen the footage. Grainy black and white film of men falling from the sky, parachutes opening over fields and hedgerows, boots hitting the ground running. It looks almost theatrical from a distance, almost rehearsed, like something out of a film where you already know how it ends. But here's the thing almost no one actually thinks about. For the men on the ground, the men looking up, the men who had never seen anything like it before, it was something else entirely. It wasn't theatrical, it wasn't rehearsed. It was terrifying in a way that no amount of training had prepared them for. And we know that. Not because of guesswork, not because of dramatized documentaries, but because the Japanese officers who survived those first encounters wrote about it, spoke about it, filed reports that their own high command struggled to process, said things in interrogations that stunned American intelligence officers, made observations that changed how the entire Pacific War was studied for decades, and almost none of that has ever been told the way it actually happened. What you're about to hear is the real story, not the American version, not the Hollywood version, but the account from the other side of the tree line. The account from men who looked up one morning, saw shapes falling from the sky, and realized in that moment that warfare had just changed forever. If that sounds like something you want to hear all the way through, hit subscribe right now, because this is the kind of story that deserves to be told completely and without cutting corners. Let's start with context, because you cannot understand the reaction without understanding what these Japanese officers were walking into. By the early 1940s, Japan had built one of the most formidable military forces in Asia. Its army was battle-hardened from years of war in China. Its navy had just devastated Pearl Harbor. Its soldiers were trained to fight with extraordinary discipline and an absolute refusal to surrender that went far beyond what most Western armies had ever encountered. Japanese military culture at this point was not simply about winning battles. It was about dying with honor, if winning was not possible. The Bushido Code, deeply embedded in the training and psychology of the Imperial Japanese Army, created soldiers who genuinely believed that death in battle was preferable to capture. This was not an abstraction. It was lived belief, enforced by culture, by officers, and by the military system itself. The result was an army that fought with ferocity, that stunned even experienced Allied commanders. At Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at Peleliu, Japanese defenders held positions until virtually every man was dead. American Marines and soldiers who fought those campaigns came home, changed. They had seen something that their training had not fully prepared them for. But here is the equally important flip side of that picture. The Japanese army in 1941 and 1942 was extraordinarily confident. Not recklessly so in its own estimation, but confident in the way that an organization becomes when it has won every engagement it has entered for over a decade. Japan had beaten Russia in 1905. It had swept through large parts of China with relative ease in some theaters. Its early Pacific campaigns, the fall of Singapore, the capture of the Philippines, the push through the Dutch East Indies, had been executed with stunning speed. Japanese officers at the start of the war carried with them an institutional belief that their fighting spirit, their discipline, their willingness to die, made them superior to any opponent they would face. They had studied Western armies. They found them soft. They found them reliant on material superiority rather than fighting will. They expected to meet opponents who would falter under pressure, who would retreat when pressed, who would negotiate rather than die. That belief was not entirely without basis in the early stages, but it created a blind spot for innovation, a blind spot for the unexpected. And it was precisely that blind spot that the first American airborne operations crashed into with devastating effect. Now let's talk about what airborne warfare actually was in the early 1940s, because even the Americans were still figuring it out. The concept of dropping soldiers from aircraft was not new by World War II. The Soviets had experimented with it in the 1930s. The Germans had executed spectacular airborne operations in the early war years. The assault on Crete in 1941 had shown what paratroopers could accomplish when everything went right. It had also shown the catastrophic losses they could suffer. American airborne development came relatively late. The 501st Parachute Infantry Battalion was activated in 1940. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were not created until 1942. And when American paratroopers first went into combat in Operation Torch in North Africa in November of 1942, it was a lesson in how not to do it. Aircraft scattered across hundreds of miles, units landed far from their objectives. Friendly fire was a serious problem. The first major American airborne operation was, in many respects, a mess. But the men who jumped learned. They refined their tactics, their equipment, and their coordination with devastating speed. And by the time American paratroopers began dropping into the Pacific Theater, they had become something genuinely new, something the Japanese military system had no framework for and no prepared response to. The first significant parachute operations in the Pacific began in late 1943 and into 1944. The theater was different from Europe in every way that mattered for airborne operations. The jungle was the dominant factor. Dense, almost impenetrable, erasing sight lines and making the kind of rapid assembly that airborne doctrine depended on nearly impossible. The heat was extraordinary. The distances were vast. The Japanese positions were dug in with an engineer's precision and defended with a zealot's commitment. For paratroopers dropping into that environment, the challenges were immense, but so was the shock effect. And it is the shock effect that the Japanese records capture with an honesty that is almost startling. One of the earliest and most detailed collections of Japanese officer testimony about American airborne operations comes from after-action reports and prisoner interrogations gathered following operations in New Guinea in 1943 and 1944. These documents, some of which were declassified decades after the war, paint a picture that is almost paradoxical. Japanese officers describing their tactical response with professional detachment, while simultaneously revealing a level of psychological disruption that their own military culture had almost no language for. Here is what those reports say, in substance if not always in direct quotation, because the translations vary, the originals are sometimes incomplete, and the archive work requires piecing together multiple sources. The consistent thread is this. The first thing that shocked Japanese officers was not the paratroopers themselves. It was the sound. Multiple accounts described the period before the drop as one of ordinary tension. Aircraft were not unusual. Allied air activity had been increasing throughout 1943 across the theater. Japanese units had developed routines for dealing with air raids. Scatter, take cover, wait for the bombing to stop, assess the damage, continue. They had protocols. They had trained responses. What they did not have was a trained response for the moment when the bombs did not fall and men did come out of the sky instead. A Japanese infantry captain whose unit encountered American paratroopers near the Markham Valley in New Guinea in September 1943, during Operation Postern, the massive Allied airborne and amphibious operation that was a turning point in the New Guinea campaign, later described his experience in a report that was captured and translated by Allied intelligence. The account describes watching the aircraft pass overhead and waiting for the bombing that did not come, then seeing what he initially described as debris or equipment falling from the aircraft, then realizing with a delay he found personally shameful that the objects were men. That delay, that moment of incomprehension, appears in multiple Japanese accounts, and it is psychologically significant. These were not unsophisticated soldiers. They were trained observers, experienced fighters. The pause before recognition was not stupidity. It was the lag that happens when the human brain encounters something for which it has no category. The brain reaches for the nearest familiar explanation, bombs, equipment, anything, before it accepts the genuinely new explanation, men, coming from the sky in large numbers, with weapons, coming for you. By the time that recognition arrived, in many instances, the paratroopers were already on the ground and moving. Operation Postern, which took place on September 5, 1943, was actually one of the most significant and least discussed Allied operations of the Pacific War. General Douglas MacArthur's forces used airborne troops, specifically the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment, along with a massive airlift operation to simultaneously capture the town of Lae from multiple directions. The airborne component dropped on Nadzab, a location inland from Lae, to seize an airstrip and cut off the Japanese garrison. The scale of it was staggering. Over 90 aircraft, nearly 1,700 paratroopers, all dropping into a confined area while artillery smoke covered the drop zone and Australian ground forces pushed from another direction entirely. For the Japanese commanders at Lae, the effect was immediate and profound. Not just the physical reality of being flanked by men who had appeared from the air, but the psychological realization that their defensive calculations had been rendered worthless in a single morning. A defensive plan that relies on controlling ground access, on knowing where the enemy can come from, on holding key terrain features, is built on a fundamental assumption that the enemy must come to you across the ground. Paratroopers destroy that assumption completely, and Japanese officers were explicit about this in their subsequent accounts. The commander of Japanese forces at Lae, facing encirclement, ordered a withdrawal through the Sarawak Gauge Range, one of the most brutal mountain crossings of the entire Pacific War. Thousands of Japanese soldiers died attempting that withdrawal, not in combat but from starvation, disease, and exhaustion in terrain so severe it broke men who had survived months of jungle fighting. And the reason for that withdrawal, the reason that march of death was ordered, was directly traceable to the decision to drop paratroopers at Nha Zab. In interrogations conducted after the fall of Leiji, captured Japanese officers were asked specifically about the airborne operation. The responses were recorded and archived. What they said, stripped of the formal military language and translated as directly as possible, amounted to this. They had not believed it was possible. Not the operation specifically, the concept itself. The idea that a military force would commit trained soldiers to an operation where those soldiers would be falling through the air, completely exposed, with no ability to maneuver, no ability to take cover, entirely dependent on landing without being killed before they reached the ground. To the Japanese military mindset, this seemed to violate a fundamental principle. You do not place your men in a position of absolute vulnerability as part of your tactical plan. You place your men in positions of strength and force the enemy to come to you. Paratroopers do the opposite. They place themselves in a position of complete vulnerability, falling through the air over enemy territory, and then depend on speed, violence, and shock to convert that vulnerability into an advantage before the enemy can respond. One captured Japanese officer, a major whose regiment had been outflanked by the Nha Zab operation, was asked whether Japanese forces had anticipated an airborne attack. His response, as recorded by the American intelligence officer conducting the interrogation, was essentially that an airborne attack had been considered theoretically possible but had been rated as extremely unlikely because the risk to the attacking force was considered too high. He said, and this is the translated version, that he had believed no commander would accept such losses in exchange for the tactical advantage. What he was describing was a failure of mirror imaging. He had looked at American planning through the lens of Japanese military values and concluded that because his own commanders would not accept the specific type of vulnerability that a parachute assault requires, American commanders would not accept it either. And he was wrong. That gap in understanding, that failure to recognize that different military cultures weight risk and tactical innovation differently, runs through virtually every Japanese account of first contact with American airborne forces. It was not simply that the Japanese were surprised by paratroopers, they were surprised that the Americans were willing to take that kind of risk at all, and that surprise itself contained within it a deeper realization that they were not fighting an enemy whose decision-making they could reliably predict. The psychological dimension of this cannot be overstated. War is in many respects a competition in prediction. Each side tries to anticipate what the other will do, builds plans around those anticipations, and allocates resources accordingly. When an enemy does something genuinely outside your predictive model, the damage is not just physical, it is epistemic. You do not just lose men or ground, you lose confidence in your ability to know what is coming next. Multiple Japanese officers in post-Nha Zab interrogations expressed variations of the same concern in ways that their interrogators found revealing. They were not simply processing a tactical defeat. They were processing an encounter with an enemy whose operational imagination extended into territory they had not mapped. One officer, whose words were recorded in a September 1943 intelligence summary that was later included in a larger classified report on Japanese attitudes toward American tactics, said something that stayed with the American intelligence officers who read it. He said that fighting an enemy who could appear anywhere from the sky made every position uncertain, that a defended position which had seemed strong in the morning could become a trap by the afternoon if men appeared behind it from the air. He used the word uncertain several times in the interrogation. His interpreter flagged it because the word he chose in Japanese carried connotations not just of military unpredictability, but of a kind of existential unsteadiness. The ground beneath his tactical assumptions had shifted. Now let's move forward in time, because the story of Japanese encounters with American paratroopers did not end in New Guinea. It evolved. And the evolution is where the most revealing accounts come from, because what Japanese officers said after the first time was shaped not just by what they experienced, but by how they processed it, adapted to it, and ultimately failed to fully counter it. In the Philippines in 1944 and 1945, American airborne operations became a central part of MacArthur's campaign to retake the archipelago. The 11th Airborne Division, one of the less celebrated but extraordinarily capable formations of the Pacific War, fought a campaign that combined conventional infantry operations with airborne assaults in a way that kept Japanese commanders permanently off balance. The 11th Airborne's operation at Tagade Ridge in February 1945 was a textbook example. While the main body of the division pushed north from Nasugbu on the Batangas coast, the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment dropped onto the ridge to seize a critical approach to Manila. The Japanese defenders in that sector had prepared for a ground assault. They had not prepared for men dropping out of the sky onto terrain they controlled. The Japanese officers who survived that operation and the subsequent fighting described, in accounts gathered during the Luzon campaign, a pattern that had become consistent by this point in the war. The initial shock was still real, even for men who by 1945 had theoretical knowledge that Americans used paratroopers. Knowing something in the abstract and experiencing it in reality are different things, and the accounts consistently reflect that gap. But there was something new in the 1945 accounts that had not been as prominent in the 1943 accounts. Alongside the shock was something that functions in the records as a kind of reluctant professional respect, filtered through a military culture that made such admissions extraordinarily difficult. Japanese officers did not commonly express admiration for enemy tactics. The cultural framework within which they operated made such admissions feel like a betrayal of the belief system that underpinned their entire approach to combat. To say that the enemy did something well was dangerously close to saying that the enemy was better, and that was a step most Japanese officers could not or would not take openly. But the records capture it anyway, not as direct admiration, but as something that reads between the lines of professional military analysis. An officer describing in precise technical terms the coordination of a parachute assault, the timing of the drop in relation to ground movements, the choice of terrain, the speed of assembly and action on the ground. In that level of analytical detail, something other than contempt is operating. A Japanese staff officer captured on Luzon in early 1945 provided an assessment of American airborne tactics that his interrogators described as one of the most technically sophisticated analyses of Allied methods they had received from any captured officer at any point in the war. He had clearly thought deeply about what he had observed and experienced. He described the American paratroopers' ability to function effectively after a disorganizing drop as the most impressive aspect of the entire system. He understood, because he was a professional soldier, that the chaos of a parachute landing, men scattered across a landscape, cut off from their units, possibly injured, with equipment missing, was supposed to be a fatal vulnerability. He had expected that vulnerability to be decisive, and it had not been. What he described seeing instead was men who had clearly been trained not just to execute a plan, but to execute a mission in the absence of a plan. Individual soldiers who encountered obstacles or separation from their units and responded not by waiting for orders or retreating, but by identifying the nearest objective and moving toward it. By finding the nearest sound of friendly fire and moving toward that. By doing something rather than freezing. He found this remarkable. He said so explicitly, and then he added something that his interrogators noted in the margin of the report as significant. He said that his own training emphasized the strength of the unit over the capability of the individual soldier. That an isolated Japanese soldier was expected to find his unit and report to his commander before taking independent action. That the American approach, in which the individual soldier was trained to act as a decision-maker in the absence of command, represented a fundamentally different philosophy of what a soldier was for. He did not say this philosophy was superior. The record suggests he would not have allowed himself to say that, but he laid out the tactical consequences of that philosophy with such clarity that the conclusion was unavoidable to anyone reading the report. American paratroopers were tactically adaptive in ways that Japanese defenders had no prepared counter for, because countering it would have required changing the fundamental structure of Japanese infantry training and doctrine. That was not something that could be done in the middle of a campaign, or, as history shows, at all before the war ended. There is another dimension to these Japanese accounts that gets almost no attention in the standard histories: the effect of airborne operations on Japanese officers who were not directly involved but who processed the reports and had to incorporate the possibility of parachute assault into their defensive planning. This secondary effect, the planning paralysis that the mere possibility of an airborne attack created, was documented in captured Japanese staff documents from multiple theaters, and it reveals something important about how the shock of the first encounters radiated outward through the entire Japanese military system. When a commander knows that paratroopers exist and have been used in his theater, he faces a planning problem that has no clean solution. Every position he holds is potentially flanked by an enemy who does not need to approach along any road or trail. Every reserve unit he holds back to respond to conventional threats might instead need to respond to men who appeared 2 miles behind his front line overnight. Every headquarters he sets up in what should be secure rear territory might become a front line without warning. The response to this problem, historically, is to distribute forces more thinly, to cover more potential threat axes. But distributing forces thinly means concentrating them less, which means any individual position becomes weaker. Japanese staff documents from the Philippines campaign show explicit evidence of this dilemma. Defensive plans that allocated forces to cover inland approaches and elevated terrain that would have been ignored entirely in a pre-airborne strategic environment. Resources spent watching empty sky instead of reinforcing positions that were actually underground assault. One captured Japanese planning document from the Luzon campaign, dated late 1944, describes the need to maintain specific reserve units capable of responding to airborne landings in each of 3 different inland zones. This was not a small allocation. These were combat-capable units being held back from the forward defense, specifically because of the airborne threat. And the airborne threat never materialized in those specific zones, but those units were not available when they were needed at the front. The threat of paratroopers, in other words, was militarily effective even in places where paratroopers never actually landed. The shadow of the capability was itself a weapon. And the Japanese officers who wrote those planning documents understood that they had been forced into a defensive posture where they were allocating real resources to counter a threat that might not materialize, while the threat that was materializing received fewer resources than it needed. One staff officer's memo, captured and translated, described this dilemma in terms that his American counterparts found almost poignant in their honesty. He wrote that defending against an enemy with air transport capability was like trying to build a wall in every direction simultaneously. That no matter how strong the position, there was always a direction from which it could be attacked that the wall did not cover. He was right, and he knew he was right. And the record suggests he wrote that memo knowing there was no solution he could offer, only an accurate description of the problem. Now let's talk about something that the standard accounts of Pacific War airborne operations almost always skip. The Japanese soldiers who were not officers. The enlisted men and NCOs whose experiences were in some ways even more visceral and less filtered than those of the officers who had the analytical framework of military education to process what they were seeing. The accounts of ordinary Japanese soldiers describing first contact with American paratroopers survive primarily in 2 forms: diaries that were captured during the Pacific Campaign and post-war testimonies gathered by Japanese historians in the decades after 1945. Both sources require careful handling. Diaries were written in the moment without reflection. Post-war testimony was filtered through memory, trauma, cultural change, and the complicated emotions of men processing defeat. But both sources contain accounts of the first airborne encounters that are unlike almost anything else in the recorded history of the Pacific War. A soldier's diary, captured in New Guinea in 1943, describes watching the Nadzab drop from a position several miles away. The writer had no direct tactical role in the engagement, but could see or hear much of what was happening. What he wrote was not a tactical analysis. It was a description of incomprehension. He wrote that he had watched the sky fill with what he described as flowers. The Japanese term he used, hanabira, literally means flower petals, and it was a term that appeared in multiple Japanese accounts of parachute landings. The visual image of a parachute canopy opening had apparently triggered the same metaphorical response in multiple independent observers. A white flower blooming in the blue sky, and then falling, and then men with weapons, coming from the flowers. He wrote that it was not frightening at first. He wrote that it was strange, beautiful even, and then the shooting started and it stopped being beautiful. The shift in that diary entry, the movement from aesthetic response to tactical reality in the space of a few written lines, captures something that the officer reports with their professional language cannot quite reach. The parachute assault was, visually, genuinely extraordinary. It was something that had no precedent in the visual experience of almost anyone who saw it for the first time. The human brain responds to novelty with something that is not quite fear, and not quite wonder, but some combination of both. And the Japanese accounts suggest that in the moments between the visual spectacle and the tactical reality, there was a kind of suspended disbelief, a pause in which the mind was doing something other than preparing to fight. That pause was tactically significant. It was brief in most cases. But brief pauses at critical moments are what battles turn on. A post-war account given by a Japanese infantryman who had fought in the Philippines described a parachute assault in terms that his Japanese interviewer apparently found uncomfortable because the account was initially left out of a published collection and only restored in a later academic edition. What the soldier said was that when the paratroopers landed around his position, his first instinct was not to fire. He said he was not sure what he was seeing was real, that the training he had received had prepared him for many things, but not for men falling from the sky and standing up and shooting at him. He said he had needed a moment, and he said that moment had cost one of his friends his life. He said this without apparent anger, with something that sounded more like wondering, and he said that the Americans who landed near him had moved with a speed and confidence that he would not have expected from men who had just fallen out of an aircraft, that they had not seemed confused or disoriented, that they had seemed, and this is the word the translation uses, ready. He found that remarkable, that men who had just done something as disorienting as falling from the sky could be ready to fight the moment they hit the ground. In the analytical literature on airborne operations, this quality is described as situational recovery, the ability to reorient quickly after the physical and psychological disruption of a parachute landing. American paratrooper training placed enormous emphasis on it precisely because the planners understood that the landing zone would be chaotic and that soldiers who could not function in chaos would die. But to a Japanese infantryman seeing it from the receiving end for the first time, it did not look like trained situational recovery. It looked like something harder to categorize. It looked like these men were at home in a situation that would have broken a normal soldier. That impression, accurate or not, did something to the psychological balance of an engagement that was already thrown off by the shock of the drop itself. There is also a specific and often overlooked category of Japanese account that deserves extended attention. The accounts of Japanese officers who had advance warning that an airborne operation was coming and still found themselves unable to mount an effective response. These accounts are perhaps the most psychologically interesting of all, because they eliminate the element of surprise and still show the same pattern of disruption and failure. In the Corregidor operation of February 1945, American intelligence gave the attacking force a significant advantage in the sense that the Japanese defenders on the island knew or strongly suspected that some form of amphibious or airborne assault was imminent. Corregidor, the fortified island at the entrance to Manila Bay, had symbolic and strategic importance that made its recapture a priority for MacArthur's forces. The Japanese garrison knew this. The garrison commander, Captain Akira Itagaki, had approximately 6,000 men on the island, though many were naval personnel rather than trained infantry, and his defensive preparations were extensive. What Itagaki did not know with certainty was the precise form the American attack would take. And when the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment dropped onto the tiny, rugged topknot of the island on February 16, 1945, simultaneously with an amphibious assault from the beach, the combination overwhelmed the defenses, even though those defenses had been prepared and manned and waiting. The surviving accounts from the Corregidor battle, from Japanese officers who were among the very few survivors of a garrison that fought almost to the last man, described the simultaneous assault from the air and the sea as creating a tactical situation for which there was no adequate response. Every reserve, every mobile element, every plan for counterattacking a beach landing was simultaneously obsolete, because men were also dropping onto the high ground. In one account, an officer who had survived long enough to observe both phases of the assault described the experience as fighting against an enemy who was already inside the position before the fighting began. That the paratroopers had appeared on ground that was supposed to be defended and were already engaging defenders from positions behind them before the amphibious force had even established a beachhead. The word he used in the original Japanese, according to the translation note, was fuiuchi, which carries the meaning of a sudden attack from an unexpected direction, but with the additional connotation of something that should not have been possible given the circumstances. Something that violated the rules of how attacks work. That connotation, the sense that the attack had violated rules, appears repeatedly in Japanese accounts of airborne operations, and it reveals something important about the psychological framework within which Japanese officers were processing what they experienced. Military training gives soldiers a model of how combat works. That model has rules, structures, expectations. An attack comes from a direction. An enemy must approach through terrain. Time and space constrain what is possible. Airborne operations break those rules. Not all of them, but enough of them to create a cognitive dissonance in men who have trained for years to operate within the model. The Japanese officers who experienced American airborne operations were not simply experiencing tactical surprise. They were experiencing something closer to what psychologists would call a schema violation. Their mental model of how battle works was being contradicted by observable reality. And the response to schema violation in high-stress conditions is not calm, rational reassessment. It is a period of disorientation followed by an attempt to force the new information into the old model, followed, if the new information is persistent enough, by a slow and painful update of the model itself. Several Japanese officers in post-war accounts describe this process explicitly. One general officer, reflecting on the New Guinea campaign years after the war, said that the greatest mistake his forces had made was in treating the American airborne capability as a variation of conventional infantry tactics, rather than as a fundamentally different kind of warfare that required a fundamentally different kind of response. He said that by the time Japanese forces had updated their thinking to account for airborne operations, the Pacific Campaign had already moved past the point where that updated thinking could make a decisive difference. He was describing, in retrospect, exactly the lag that the Japanese military system's institutional confidence and resistance to tactical innovation had created. The belief that their own fighting spirit and discipline would overcome enemy material and technical advantages had served as a filter that slowed the processing of lessons from early airborne encounters. If you believe that superior fighting will defeat superior tactics, you are slow to update your tactics in response to an enemy whose technical innovation is outpacing your own. The Japanese military system's extraordinary strengths, its discipline, its fighting spirit, its willingness to absorb punishment that would have broken other armies, became in this context a liability. Because the strength of that system depended on a set of assumptions about how war worked, that American airborne operations specifically, and American tactical innovation generally, were dismantling engagement by engagement. The 11th Airborne Division's operations in the Philippines in 1945 generated some of the most detailed Japanese officer accounts of the entire war, in part because a number of Japanese officers survived those operations long enough to be interrogated, and in part because the operations themselves were extraordinarily complex and tested both American paratroopers and Japanese defenders in ways that revealed deep truths about both. One series of interrogations conducted in February and March 1945 focused specifically on Japanese officer assessments of American airborne doctrine and how it had evolved since the early Pacific operations. The officers interrogated were of varying ranks and units, but several consistent themes emerged that the intelligence officers found worth highlighting in their summary reports. The first theme was the assessment of American paratrooper physical conditioning. Multiple Japanese officers described American paratroopers as notably more robust than standard American infantry in terms of their ability to sustain operations under adverse physical conditions. One officer attributed this specifically to the selection and training process for parachute units, which he had clearly studied to some extent, and noted that the physical standards for American airborne units exceeded those for standard infantry by a significant margin. He said this mattered tactically because parachute landings in jungle and mountain terrain in the Philippines were extremely physically demanding, and that units which arrived in good physical condition were capable of immediate aggressive action in a way that less fit units would not have been. He was correct. American parachute infantry regiments had physical standards that were substantially higher than conventional infantry, and the training pipeline was deliberately brutal in ways that were designed to ensure that by the time a man pinned on his wings, he was physically capable of functioning effectively under conditions that would incapacitate ordinary soldiers. The second theme was the assessment of American junior officer and NCO quality. This came up repeatedly and emphatically enough that the intelligence summary report devoted a full section to it. Japanese officers described American paratrooper sergeants and lieutenants as operating with a degree of tactical independence and decision-making initiative that they found unusual compared to what they had observed in conventional American infantry. One colonel described a specific engagement in which his position had been penetrated and overrun by what intelligence subsequently confirmed was a reinforced platoon of paratroopers, fewer than 50 men, who had operated without apparent communication with a higher headquarters for several hours and had made a series of tactical decisions that a Japanese officer of equivalent rank would have referred upward for approval. He said the speed of those decisions had been decisive, that by the time his own unit had properly assessed the situation and requested guidance from the battalion, the American platoon had already achieved its objective and consolidated. He was not complimenting the Americans. He was explaining why he had lost. But the explanation contained within it a precise and accurate analysis of one of the defining differences between American airborne doctrine and Japanese infantry doctrine. American paratroopers were trained to lead at every level. Japanese infantry were trained to follow. In a conventional battle, that distinction matters less because the command structure is intact and orders flow continuously. In the chaotic aftermath of a parachute assault, where units are fragmented, communications are disrupted, and the situation changes faster than orders can travel, the ability of every sergeant and corporal to act as a decision-maker is a decisive advantage. The Japanese officers understood this. The analysis in their captured reports and interrogation transcripts is sophisticated enough to make clear that they saw the mechanism precisely. What they could not do was change it, because changing it would have required not just updating tactics but dismantling and rebuilding the foundational philosophy of what a Japanese soldier was supposed to be. He was supposed to be a perfect instrument of his commander's will, not a decision-maker, an instrument. The American paratrooper was trained to be both, and in the specific conditions of an airborne assault, that distinction was lethal. There is one more category of Japanese account that deserves attention. The accounts that deal not with the tactical or psychological dimensions of encountering American paratroopers, but with the emotional and almost philosophical dimension. These accounts are rarer, more personal, and more revealing in certain ways than the professional military analyses. They appear most often in post-war memoirs and testimonies, filtered through decades of reflection. A Japanese infantry officer who had fought on Leyte in 1944 and survived the war wrote a memoir in the 1960s that included a lengthy account of observing an American parachute operation. He had not been directly engaged in the fighting that followed, but had watched the drop from a concealed position at some distance. His account of the drop itself is among the most evocative in any Japanese source. He described the sound of the aircraft engines building over the course of several minutes, the way the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once because the formation was so large. He described the first parachutes opening as a kind of punctuation, a moment of visual clarity after the noise and confusion of the aircraft. He described watching them fall and thinking, and this translation is as close to the original as the translator could achieve, that they were brave in a way he could not quite categorize. He wrote that in his tradition, bravery was expressed through endurance, through holding a position against an overwhelming attack, through dying rather than retreating, through absorbing punishment without complaint or surrender. He wrote that he had always thought of bravery as fundamentally defensive in nature, the bravery of holding on. He wrote that what he saw falling from the sky that morning was a different kind of bravery, the bravery of letting go, of stepping out of an aircraft into empty air over enemy territory and trusting your equipment and your training and your companions to make something possible out of what looked like certain disaster. He wrote that he did not know what to do with that observation, that it did not fit any of the categories he had been given for understanding an enemy, that an enemy was supposed to be lesser in some essential quality than your own side, or else the entire project of fighting and dying was without meaning, and that watching those men fall from the sky and then stand up and start fighting, he had found it difficult to locate the quality in which they were lesser. He did not say they were better. The memoir makes clear he never reached that conclusion, but he documented, with unusual honesty, the moments in which the conclusion he had been trained to reach, the conclusion that his entire military culture demanded, was not supported by what his eyes were telling him. That account was written 20 years after the war, but the seeds of it were planted in a field in Leyte in 1944, watching white parachutes open against a blue sky. And the fact that he was still turning it over 2 decades later says something about what those moments did to the men who experienced them. The first time American paratroopers dropped on Japanese forces, the physical results were significant. Positions were outflanked, garrisons were cut off, defenses that had taken weeks to build were rendered worthless in hours. The strategic consequences across New Guinea, the Philippines, and beyond were immense. But the psychological and intellectual consequences are the ones that the Japanese officer accounts reveal most clearly. Because those accounts tell a story that goes deeper than tactics and terrain. They tell the story of a military system encountering something it had not imagined, processing that encounter through the filters of a culture that made honest reassessment extraordinarily difficult, and struggling to adapt in real time to an opponent whose operational creativity was outpacing their own institutional framework. The Japanese officers who filed those reports, who gave those interrogations, who wrote those memoirs, were not incompetent. Many of them were brilliant, courageous, and professionally sophisticated. They understood what they were seeing, with a precision that their own system could not fully use. The tragedy, from a purely analytical perspective, is not that they failed to understand American airborne doctrine. It is that they understood it clearly enough to know exactly why they could not counter it. One of the most striking lines in the entire body of Japanese officer testimony about American airborne operations comes from a post-war account given by a Japanese general who had commanded forces in the Philippines and had experienced multiple American parachute operations. He was being interviewed by a Japanese historian in the late 1950s. The historian asked him what single quality of American airborne forces had most surprised him. He thought for a long time before answering, and then he said something that the historian noted had been said quietly and without apparent emotion. He said that what surprised him most was not the bravery of jumping from aircraft, or the physical capability of the soldiers, or even the coordination of the operations. He said what surprised him most was that they believed it would work. He said that in his experience, soldiers fight best when they believe they are doing something possible. That even the most disciplined army fights differently when the men inside it believe the objective is achievable. He said that American paratroopers seemed to believe completely in the possibility of what they were doing, even when what they were doing looked, from the outside, like something that should not succeed. And he said that belief itself was a weapon, one he had not known how to take away from them. That observation, simple as it sounds, is one of the most precise assessments of what American airborne forces brought to the Pacific War that appears in any source, Japanese or American. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions are celebrated in the European theater with a richness of documentation and popular culture that the Pacific airborne story has never quite matched. But the Pacific story, told through the accounts of the men who looked up and saw those parachutes opening, is in some ways even more revealing. Because in Europe, both sides had experience with airborne operations before Americans jumped. The Germans had used paratroopers extensively. The British had developed their own parachute forces. The doctrinal framework was not entirely new to anyone involved. In the Pacific, it was new, genuinely new. And the reactions it generated were less filtered by prior experience, less processed through existing mental models, more raw, and therefore more honest. The Japanese officers who wrote those reports and gave those interrogations and filed those after-action analyses were doing something that military professionals are trained to do. They were trying to understand what had happened and why, so they could respond to it effectively the next time. Most of them never got the next time. The Pacific War moved too fast and the balance of forces shifted too decisively for any lesson, however accurately drawn, to produce a reversal of fortune. But the documents they left behind are an extraordinary resource. Not just for understanding Japanese military thinking, not just for understanding American airborne capability, but for understanding something larger about what happens when a military force encounters something genuinely outside its experience and has to process that encounter in real time, under fire, with the consequences of misunderstanding measured in lives. Those paratroopers falling through the Pacific sky were many things at once. They were soldiers with jobs to do, and weapons in their hands, and training that had cost years and extraordinary effort. They were Americans far from home, doing something dangerous in service of something they had been told was worth dying for. They were, from the ground, men falling from the sky